year was 1177. The sun rose blood-red over the coastal plains of Palestine, as if the heavens themselves knew what was coming. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, that impossible crusader dream carved from the heart of the Muslim world, stood as a fragile jewel set against an ocean of enemies. For nearly 80 years, Christian knights had clung to these sun-scorched lands, holding the holiest city in Christendom against forces that vastly outnumbered them. Generation after generation of crusaders had bled and died on this soil. They had won battles and lost them. They had built castles and watched them fall. They had buried fathers and sons in the same rocky ground. But somehow, against all logic and probability, they had survived. Now, a shadow darker than any before stretched across the desert horizon. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. The West would come to know him simply as Saladin. Before we begin this journey into one of the Holy Land's darkest and most extraordinary stories, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. And if this is your first time on our channel, subscribe now, because what you're about to hear is a story that history books often reduce to footnotes, but the men who lived it would never forget. This is the tale of how a dying teenager, a handful of warrior monks, and an act of impossible courage turned the tide of an empire. Saladin had achieved what no Muslim leader had managed in generations. He had unified Egypt and Syria under his command, bringing together territories that had been divided since the earliest days of Islam's expansion. He commanded armies that stretched beyond the horizon, warriors hardened by decades of warfare against crusaders, Byzantines, and rival Muslim factions. His treasury overflowed with Egyptian gold. His reputation for military brilliance preceded him like the shadow of an approaching storm, and in November of 1177, he set his sights on Jerusalem itself. The timing was calculated with deadly precision. Count Philip of Flanders had arrived in the Holy Land with a powerful army of European knights, fresh, eager, and hungry for glory. But instead of defending Jerusalem as the Crusader lords had hoped, Philip had been lured northward to Syria, chasing the mirage of conquest at the siege of Hama. He took with him the bulk of the kingdom's fighting force, the Knights Hospitaller in their black mantles, hundreds of seasoned Templar knights, and most of the feudal lords who owed military service to the crown. Jerusalem was left nearly defenseless. The young king who remained to face this catastrophe was unlike any monarch the Crusader states had ever known. Baldwin IV had ascended to the throne at 13 years old, inheriting a kingdom that stretched from Beirut to the edges of Egypt. Now 16, he was considered a man by medieval standards, expected to lead armies and make decisions that would determine the fate of hundreds of thousands. But Baldwin carried within his flesh a sentence worse than any enemy sword could deliver. He was a leper. The disease had first revealed itself when Baldwin was 9 years old. His tutor, the historian William of Tyre, had noticed something troubling during the boys' games at court. The children would play rough as children do, pinching, scratching, testing each other's pain tolerance and the casual cruelty of youth. But while other children cried out when hurt, young Baldwin felt nothing in his right arm. He could be pinched until he bruised and never flinch. William, educated in the medical traditions of both Europe and the East, recognized the terrible truth immediately. He had seen leprosy before, in the hospices and lazar houses that dotted the Holy Land. He knew what that numbness meant. He knew what awaited the boy. By the time Baldwin became king, the disease had begun its relentless advance. His right hand was losing sensation, the nerves dying one by one. Soon the fingers would curl inward, useless. The flesh of his arm would rot while he still lived. His face would be consumed feature by feature until he was unrecognizable. And through it all, through all the horror and decay, his mind would remain sharp, trapped within a body that was slowly dying. Yet Baldwin refused to hide. He refused to surrender his throne to regents and advisors. He refused to let others fight his battles while he waited for death in some comfortable prison. And when word reached Jerusalem that Saladin had crossed the border with an army chroniclers numbered at 26,000 men, Baldwin refused to cower behind his walls. The messengers arrived in Jerusalem on November 18, 1177, their horses lathered with sweat, their voices hoarse from shouting warnings across every village between the border and the holy city. Saladin was coming, not in raid or skirmish, but with the full might of the Ayyubid Empire at his back. The message spread through the narrow streets of Jerusalem like fire through dry brush. Merchants closed their shops. Women gathered their children. Priests began saying prayers for the dying that they expected to be saying for themselves within weeks. Baldwin summoned what forces remained. The count was devastating. Most of the kingdom's fighting men were in the north with Philip of Flanders, chasing glory at the siege of Hama. The garrisons that remained in the southern fortresses were skeleton crews, barely enough to man the walls of their own castles. The royal treasury was depleted from years of continuous warfare. Reinforcements from Europe were months away, if they came at all. When the final tally was made, Baldwin could muster only 375 knights, 375 armored horsemen, against an army that covered the landscape like locusts, against the most successful Muslim general in a century, against 26,000 hardened warriors who had been promised the plunder of Jerusalem itself. Any rational commander would have sealed the gates of Jerusalem and prayed for a miracle. Any sensible king would have sent messengers begging for negotiation, offering tribute, buying time at any cost. Baldwin IV was not rational. He was not sensible. He was something far more dangerous. He was a king who knew he was dying, who had already watched his own body begin to betray him, and who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "With God as my guide," he declared to his assembled council, "I will set out to do what I can." The nobles who heard these words exchanged uncertain glances. Some thought their young king had finally succumbed to the madness that sometimes accompanied his disease. Others saw something else in his eyes, a fierce determination that transcended mere courage. Among those who would ride with Baldwin was a man whose reputation preceded him like the rumble of thunder before a storm. Reynaud of Chatillon had spent 15 years rotting in a Muslim prison in Aleppo. 15 years of darkness, of chains, of watching other prisoners break and die around him. 15 years of hatred fermenting in his soul. He had emerged from that hell just 1 year earlier, older, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. His hatred for Saladin was not political or religious. It was personal, refined through years of suffering to an edge sharper than Damascus steel. Reynaud was controversial even among the Crusaders. He had tortured Aymery of Limoges, the Patriarch of Antioch, by smearing honey on the old man's head and leaving him in the sun to be tormented by insects. He had sacked the Christian island of Cyprus in a savage raid that horrified even his allies. He would later launch pirate expeditions into the Red Sea that threatened Mecca itself. Historians would argue for centuries whether he was a visionary strategist who understood that Saladin had to be confronted aggressively, or a reckless madman whose provocations would ultimately doom the Crusader states. But no one, not his allies, not his enemies, ever questioned his courage. On that November morning, as Baldwin struggled to mount his horse, his weakening arm requiring assistance from his squire, it was Reynaud who would command the Crusader forces in the field. Baldwin would lead, inspiring his men with his presence. But Reynaud would fight. They rode south toward Ascalon, a coastal fortress that stood between Saladin and his ultimate prize. Behind them marched what infantry could be gathered on short notice, perhaps 2,000 men, armed with spears, axes, and crossbows. Many were not soldiers at all, but farmers, merchants, and pilgrims who had answered the arriere ban, the desperate call that summoned every able-bodied Christian man to defend the kingdom. These were not professional warriors. They were bakers who had never held a sword in anger, shepherds who had never seen an army, pilgrims who had come to pray at the Holy Sepulchre and found themselves conscripted into a war they barely understood. But they marched. They followed their leper king into what seemed like certain death because they believed, or because they had no other choice. The true cross rode with them. This was no mere symbol. The relic, believed to be the actual wood upon which Christ had been crucified, was the most sacred object in the Crusader arsenal. It had been discovered during the First Crusade, when Crusaders had pried apart the foundations of a Jerusalem church and found the ancient wood where it had been hidden for centuries. Since then, the true cross had been carried into every major battle the Crusaders fought. It was believed to channel divine power, to make men stronger, braver, more than human. When it appeared on the battlefield, soldiers believed that God himself fought alongside them. Bishop Albert of Bethlehem bore the cross at the head of the column. The autumn sun caught its golden casing, sending flashes of light across the marching army. Men who had been trembling with fear felt something stir in their hearts. They were still vastly outnumbered. They were still riding toward almost certain death. But they were not alone. While Baldwin rode south, another drama was unfolding at the fortress of Gaza. The Knights Templar, the most feared warriors in all Christendom, held Gaza as their personal stronghold. This ancient city, which had been fought over since the days of the pharaohs, now served as the Templars' forward operating base against Egyptian incursions. When Saladin's advance scouts had appeared on the horizon, the Templars had prepared for a siege. The fortress was well supplied, its walls thick, its garrison experienced. They could hold for months if necessary. 84 Knight brothers occupied the fortress under the command of their Grand Master, Odo of Saint-Amand. Odo was a man carved from the same stone as the fortress he defended. Born to a noble family in Limousin, France, he had joined the Templars nearly 50 years earlier, in the order's earliest days when it was still a small band of knights guarding pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. He had risen through every rank: marshal, commander, treasurer, and finally, Grand Master. He had survived battles that had killed better men. He had buried friends and enemies alike across the length of the Holy Land. He followed the Templar rule with fanatical precision, refusing to bend even when kings demanded it. When King Amalric had once demanded that Odo surrender a Templar knight accused of murdering an Ismaili dignitary, Odo had refused. The Pope alone, he declared, had authority over the Knights of the Temple. No king, no patriarch, no earthly power could compel a Templar to submit to secular justice. The knight in question had mysteriously died before the dispute could be resolved. Many whispered that Odo had ordered the murder himself rather than submit to royal authority. Others said the knight had taken his own life to preserve the order's honor. The truth died with him. Now, as Saladin's forces encircled Gaza, Odo faced an impossible choice. He could remain in the fortress, safe behind its walls, and wait for the storm to pass. The Templars had provisions for months. They could simply lock the gates, man the battlements, and watch as Saladin marched past them toward Jerusalem. The rules of war would not condemn such a choice. 84 knights could not be expected to challenge an army of 26,000. Survival was not cowardice, but Odo knew what that meant. If Saladin reached Jerusalem, if the holy city fell while the Templars sat in safety, the order's sacred mission, the protection of Christian pilgrims and the defense of the faith, would be exposed as a hollow oath. The Templars would survive, but their honor would die. Worse, Odo had learned that his king was riding to battle. A 16-year-old leper, with barely 300 knights, was marching to face the greatest Muslim army assembled in a generation. Baldwin had not asked the Templars for help. He knew they were under siege. He had not commanded them. He had no authority over the order. He had simply done what honor demanded and ridden south. And the Templars, the elite warriors of Christ, were hiding behind walls. Odo made his decision. On the night of November 24th, under cover of darkness, the gates of Gaza swung open. 84 Templar knights, their white mantles blazing with the red cross of their order, charged into the darkness. They carried no baggage, no supplies, nothing that would slow them down. Only their weapons, their armor, and their faith. They cut through the surprised Muslim pickets like a blade through parchment. Saladin had left only a small force to contain the Templars, never imagining they would attempt a breakout. By the time the alarm was raised, Odo and his knights had vanished into the night. They rode through the darkness without rest, their war horses' hooves drumming against the earth like a heartbeat. They pushed their mounts to the edge of exhaustion and beyond. Some horses collapsed and had to be left behind. Some knights found themselves walking, then running, then mounting captured Muslim horses and continuing the desperate race. By dawn, they had found Baldwin's army. The sight of those white-cloaked warriors emerging from the morning mist sent a wave of emotion through the Crusader ranks. Men who had been counting the hours until their death suddenly felt hope surge through them. The Templars had come, the elite of the elite, the warrior monks who had never broken in battle. 84 brothers. It seemed a pitiful addition to an already outnumbered force, but those 84 men represented the finest cavalry in the known world. Each Templar knight had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Each had trained for years in the art of mounted warfare. Each was prepared, eager, even, to die for Christ. Odo of Saint-Amand rode directly to Baldwin's side. The two men, the dying king and the aging warrior, exchanged no flowery greetings. There was no time for ceremony. "Where is Saladin?" Odo asked. "He believes we are still cowering in Ascalon," Baldwin replied. "He has allowed his forces to spread across the land, pillaging as they go. His army is scattered from Ramla to Lydda." A smile crossed Odo's weathered face. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a wolf spotting an unguarded flock. Then God has delivered him into our hands. Saladin had made his first mistake. The Sultan had conquered Egypt through cunning and patience. He had unified Syria through diplomacy and strategic marriage alliances. He had outmaneuvered rivals, suppressed rebellions, and built an empire that stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates. He was, by any measure, one of the most brilliant military minds of his era. But on that November campaign, his brilliance failed him. He had expected Baldwin to behave like a rational commander. When word reached Saladin that the young king had only a few hundred knights, he dismissed the threat entirely. A leper child with a handful of riders was no danger to an army of 26,000. Saladin had fought larger forces than Baldwin's as a warm-up exercise. More importantly, Saladin believed he understood his enemy. The Crusaders were cautious fighters, preferring to shelter behind their fortresses rather than risk open battle. They had learned hard lessons about challenging Muslim armies in the field. They would wait for reinforcements from Europe, would negotiate, would stall for time. They would not attack. Secure in this belief, Saladin allowed his forces to fan out across the coastal plain, plundering the rich Christian settlements with impunity. His cavalry raided Ramla and Lydda, ancient cities that had been Christian since the time of the Apostles. His infantry sacked the farms and villages that dotted the landscape, taking grain, livestock, and anything else of value. His baggage train, laden with treasures looted from Christian homes, stretched for miles behind the main army. Wagons groaned under the weight of gold and silver, silks and spices, slaves and livestock. Discipline relaxed. Scouts were recalled. Why waste resources watching for an enemy too weak to fight? Saladin himself continued his leisurely march toward Jerusalem, savoring the anticipation of his greatest triumph. The holy city, lost to Islam for nearly 80 years, would soon be his. He would pray in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. He would purify the Dome of the Rock from the Christian contamination. He would be remembered as the liberator of Jerusalem, the greatest hero of Islam since the Prophet himself. He did not know that Baldwin was shadowing him. The Crusaders had broken out of Ascalon and were tracking the Muslim army along the coast. Baldwin's scouts, many of them local Turcopoles who knew every wadi and hill of the region, reported back with crucial intelligence. Saladin's army was dispersed over a vast area. His cavalry was exhausted from the march up from Egypt. His infantry was scattered across the countryside, burdened with plunder. Their formations dissolved into bands of looters. His officers had lost track of their units. His supply wagons were stuck in the mud of a seasonal riverbed. The Sultan had no idea the Christians were within striking distance. On November 25th, Baldwin's army caught sight of Saladin's main force near a place called Montgisar, close to the town of Ramla. The Muslims were attempting to cross a muddy riverbed, their baggage wagons mired in the soft earth. Soldiers struggled to free the wheels while officers shouted contradictory orders. Some units had forded the stream, others were still waiting on the far bank. The army that had seemed so invincible was stretched out, disorganized, vulnerable. It was the moment Baldwin had been waiting for. The young king called his commanders to him: Renaud of Châtillon, Odo of Saint-Amand, Baldwin of Ibelin and his brother Balian, Jocelyn III of Edessa. The lords of the Crusader kingdom gathered on a low hill overlooking the Muslim host. Baldwin turned to face his men. His right arm was wrapped in bandages, his face partially concealed by cloth to hide the advancing ravages of his disease. But his voice carried across the assembled army with perfect clarity. "Brothers," he said, "we stand before the enemy of our faith and our kingdom. Many of you have watched fathers and sons march off to war and never return. Today, that may be our fate as well." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I tell you this, better to die here, with sword in hand, fighting for the cross, than to live as slaves in a conquered land. Better to meet God today as warriors than to spend our remaining years as broken men who watched Jerusalem fall." He raised the true cross high above his head. The relic caught the morning sun and blazed with light. "Behold the cross on which our Lord suffered for our sins. Let no Christian man flee from this field while this banner still flies. God wills it." The cry echoed across the army, taken up by every throat. "God wills it. God wills it." Baldwin lowered the cross and nodded to Renaud of Châtillon. "Give the order." Renaud drew his sword. The steel sang as it cleared the scabbard. "Templars to the center. Knights form on the wings. Infantry hold the rear and protect the cross." He paused, letting his commands register with the officers. Then, with a roar that seemed to shake the very earth, "Charge!" What happened next would be remembered for centuries. Odo of Saint-Amand kicked his war-horse into motion. The destrier, a massive beast bred for war, surged forward, its hooves tearing at the earth. Behind him, 84 Templar knights lowered their lances and surged forward in perfect formation. They rode as one body, as one mind. Years of training had forged them into a single instrument of war. Each knight knew exactly where his brothers would be, exactly how the formation would move. They did not need to see each other to maintain perfect alignment. Their horses' hooves shook the ground like an earthquake. Dust billowed behind them in a great cloud. The white mantles streamed in the wind, transforming them into avenging angels descending from heaven. They struck the Muslim center like a hammer blow from God. The impact was catastrophic. Saladin's soldiers, caught completely off guard, tried to form defensive lines, but there was no time. The Templar lances punched through shields and armor with sickening efficiency. Men were impaled and lifted from their saddles. Horses screamed and fell, crushing riders beneath them. The carefully maintained formation of the Templars drove through the Muslim ranks like a wedge splitting wood. Men who tried to stand before them died. Men who tried to flee were ridden down. The white-cloaked knights moved through the enemy army like death incarnate. Behind the Templars came the rest of the Crusader cavalry. Reynald of Chatillon fought at their head, 15 years of imprisoned rage finally finding its outlet. He cut through the enemy with savage precision, his sword never stopping, his horse never slowing. Men who stood before him died. Men who fled were run down. The secular knights of Jerusalem followed their commanders into the chaos. Baldwin of Ibelin, one of the kingdom's most respected warriors, led his household troops into the thick of the fighting. His brother Balian fought beside him, the two siblings guarding each other's backs as they had done in a dozen previous battles. And Baldwin IV himself joined the charge. The leper king, whose arm was so weakened he could barely hold a lance, rode into the heart of the battle. His presence electrified the Christian army. If their dying king could fight, how could any man hold back? Knights who had been hesitating spurred their horses forward. Infantry who had been hanging back surged into the fray. The Muslim army began to disintegrate. Saladin's commanders tried desperately to rally their troops. Taqi ad-Din, Saladin's own nephew, fought with tremendous courage, gathering what warriors he could and attempting to form a defensive line. But his men were being overwhelmed from every direction. The Crusaders had achieved what should have been impossible. They had caught a superior force scattered, surprised, and completely unprepared. One Templar knight, his name lost to history, his face hidden beneath his helm, cut his way through Saladin's personal bodyguard. The Mamluk guards, elite slave soldiers who had sworn to die for their master, fell one by one before his blade. He came within arm's reach of the Sultan himself, close enough that contemporary chroniclers would record the terror in Saladin's eyes. The knight raised his sword for the killing blow. A Mamluk guard threw himself between them. The Templar's blade bit deep into the guard's shoulder, but the moment's delay was enough. Other bodyguards swarmed the knight, dragging him from his horse and cutting him down in a frenzy of desperate slashing. Saladin, for the only time in his legendary career, fled the battlefield. He commandeered a racing camel, the fastest animal available, and galloped toward Egypt with a handful of survivors. Behind him, his army died. The Crusaders did not stop at the victory. As the Muslim center collapsed, the Crusader commanders made a decision that would maximize the destruction. Rather than consolidating their gains and allowing the enemy to regroup, they pressed the attack. Every knight who could still ride was ordered into pursuit. Every soldier who could still run was sent to hunt down survivors. They pursued the fleeing Muslims for 12 miles across the coastal plain, hunting them down like wolves chasing scattered sheep. Knights whose horses were exhausted commandeered fresh mounts from the battlefield debris and continued the chase. Infantry who could not keep up with the cavalry formed hunting parties, tracking down small groups of survivors. The rout was complete. Men who had been confident of victory just hours before now ran for their lives. They threw away their weapons to lighten their loads. They abandoned wagons loaded with plunder. They left wounded comrades crying for help in the dust. And still the Christians came. Reynald of Chatillon was a demon in the pursuit. He seemed inexhaustible, his arm rising and falling with mechanical precision, his sword taking lives with every stroke. 15 years of hatred, 15 years of darkness and chains and suffering, all of it poured out in that endless afternoon of slaughter. Men who surrendered found no mercy from Reynold. Men who begged were cut down mid-plea. The Lord of Ultra-Jourdain had waited too long for this moment to show restraint. The Templars, for their part, fought with cold professionalism. They did not kill for vengeance or pleasure. They killed because killing was their sacred duty. Each Muslim who died was one fewer enemy who could threaten Jerusalem. Each enemy horse captured was one more mount for Christian forces. They worked through the fleeing army methodically, efficiently, without passion. Baldwin IV remained with the main body of the army, unable to keep pace with the pursuit, but unwilling to leave the field. His physicians had begged him to return to camp, to rest his failing body. He had refused. A king did not abandon his soldiers while the battle still raged. He watched as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the battlefield in shades of gold and crimson. The dying light made the blood-soaked earth look almost beautiful, in the terrible way that only war can be beautiful. By the time darkness finally forced the Christians to halt, the plain of Montgisard was carpeted with the dead. Later estimates would suggest that Saladin lost over 20,000 men, killed, captured, or scattered across the desert to die of thirst and exposure. The baggage train, all that plundered wealth, fell into Christian hands. Prisoners were taken by the hundreds. Saladin himself reached Egypt with barely a tenth of the force he had led so confidently into the Holy Land. It was the worst defeat of his entire career. It was a humiliation that would haunt him for the rest of his life. When dawn broke over Montgisard on November 26th, the full horror of the battle became visible. Bodies lay everywhere. Muslim soldiers, stripped of their weapons and valuables by Christian scavengers, sprawled in grotesque poses across the churned earth. Horses that had survived the night stood trembling beside their fallen riders, too exhausted or too loyal to flee. Vultures circled overhead in patient spirals, waiting for the living to leave so the dead could be consumed. The Crusaders had won, but victory, they discovered, carried its own terrible cost. Roger de Moulins, the Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller, would later report the Christian casualties to the Pope: 1,100 dead, 750 wounded seriously enough to require transport back to Jerusalem. For an army that had started with perhaps 3,000 men, these were staggering losses. The Templars had suffered grievously. Of the 84 knights who had charged with Odo of Saint-Amand, dozens would never ride again. Their squires and sergeants, the lesser men who fought beside the knights, fared even worse. The order would spend years recovering its strength, recruiting new brothers from Europe, training them in the harsh methods that made Templars different from ordinary knights. But they had won. Baldwin IV sat on his horse at the edge of the battlefield, watching his men gather the dead for burial. Christian soldiers would be interred with prayers and ceremonies. Muslim dead would be left for the scavengers or buried in mass graves. The young king's body ached with exhaustion. His arm throbbed beneath its bandages. The excitement of battle had faded, leaving behind only the grim reality of what they had achieved and what it had cost. Reynold of Châtillon rode up beside him. The older knight was splattered with blood from helm to boot. None of it was his own. He had fought for hours without rest, and his face bore the strange, hollow expression of a man who had seen too much death. "We should pursue them to Egypt," Reynold said. "Finish what we started. Saladin is weak now. We may never have another chance like this." Baldwin shook his head slowly. "We don't have the strength. Our men are exhausted. Our horses are dying. Half our army is wounded. We hold the field, and that is enough." "Is it?" Reynold's voice carried an edge of frustration. "Today we humiliated him. Tomorrow he will gather another army. He controls Egypt, Syria, all the wealth and manpower of the Muslim world. He will come again, and we may not catch him by surprise next time." "I know." Baldwin's voice was soft but steady. "But I am not my father, Reynold. I cannot march my army across the Sinai Desert and conquer Egypt. I can barely mount my own horse without assistance." He held up his bandaged hand. "This will only grow worse. The disease does not stop. It does not sleep. It takes a little more of me every day." He looked across the corpse-strewn plain, his eyes distant. "All I can do is buy time. Time for the kingdom to find a new king. Time for reinforcements to arrive from Europe. Time for my sister to marry someone who can hold what we have built. Every year I keep the kingdom together is a year that Jerusalem remains Christian." Reynold was silent for a long moment. Whatever he thought of Baldwin's words, he kept it to himself. "Then we had better make today count," he finally said. "The world should know what happened here. Every court in Europe should hear that a handful of Christians shattered the greatest army Islam has fielded in a century. Baldwin nodded. Write to the Pope. Write to the kings of France and England. Tell them what the Knights Templar did today. Tell them what ordinary men can accomplish when they fight for something greater than themselves. He paused. And build me a monastery on this field, dedicated to Saint Catherine, whose feast day we celebrate tomorrow. Let future generations remember that God did not abandon us. The road back to Cairo was a nightmare. Saladin's shattered army straggled across the Sinai desert in broken groups of 2s and 3s. Many had lost their horses and stumbled on foot through the sand. Others had thrown away their weapons, their armor, anything that weighed them down. All had lost hope. The desert, which had seemed so easily crossed on the march north, now revealed itself as a killer. Men who had lost their water died of thirst. Men who wandered from the main routes died of exposure. Men who collapsed from exhaustion simply never rose again. The Bedouin tribes of the desert, who served as scouts and guides for whoever paid them, smelled weakness. These nomadic warriors held no loyalty to Saladin, only to gold. And now, seeing the Sultan's army broken and defenseless, they saw opportunity. Bedouin raiders swept down on the retreating Muslims. They stripped stragglers of their remaining possessions. They captured exhausted soldiers and sold them into slavery. They killed those who resisted without mercy. Contemporary chroniclers would record that Saladin reached Cairo having lost 9 of every 10 men he had led into Palestine. Some losses came from the battle itself. Many more came from the desert crossing, from thirst and exhaustion and Bedouin blades. For Saladin, the defeat was more than military. It was spiritual. He had proclaimed himself the champion of Islam, the leader who would reclaim Jerusalem for the faith. He had gathered the mightiest army seen in generations, and he had been routed by a leprous teenager and a few hundred knights. Muslim historians would struggle to explain the catastrophe for generations. Some blamed divine punishment for sins unknown. Others suggested treachery within Saladin's own ranks. The Sultan himself remained largely silent about the battle, an unusual reticence for a leader who typically celebrated his victories with elaborate proclamations. But Saladin was not a man to accept defeat. In the months following Montgisard, he began the slow, painful work of rebuilding. He levied new taxes to fund a replacement army. He negotiated with the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad for legitimacy and support. He dispatched agents to recruit Mamluks from the slave markets of Central Asia. Most importantly, he studied what had gone wrong. The Christians had caught him by surprise. That would never happen again. He would train his scouts more rigorously. He would keep his army concentrated rather than allowing it to scatter for plunder. He would never again underestimate a desperate enemy. 2 years later, at the Battle of Marj Ayoun, Saladin would prove that he had learned his lessons well. He would defeat Baldwin's army, capture Odo of Saint-Amand himself, and begin the systematic erosion of Crusader power that would culminate at Hattin a decade later. But that was the future. In late 1177, Saladin was a humiliated man, licking his wounds in Cairo and swearing vengeance against the Christians who had shamed him. And in Jerusalem, a dying king was celebrated as a hero. Baldwin IV returned to Jerusalem in triumph. The people of the holy city lined the streets to welcome their king. They threw flowers before his horse. They wept with joy and relief. They cheered until their voices gave out. For one shining moment, the shadows that haunted the Crusader kingdom seemed to lift. Baldwin dismounted at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site in Christendom, and gave thanks for his victory. The true cross was carried inside with elaborate ceremony. Priests who had been preparing for martyrdom now sang hymns of thanksgiving. Candles were lit. Masses were said. The whole city celebrated. Word of Montgisard spread across the Mediterranean world with astonishing speed. Ships carried the news to Italy, to France, to England. Messengers rode the roads of Europe, spreading the story of the leper king who had defeated the mighty Saladin. In Rome, Pope Alexander III received the news with tears of gratitude. He immediately issued proclamations praising Baldwin's courage and calling on the faithful to support the Holy Land with men, money, and prayers. The victory was proof, he declared, that God still favored his chosen warriors. In France and England, the story of the leper king electrified the nobility. Young knights who had been hesitating about taking the cross suddenly found their courage. Wealthy lords who had been reluctant to fund crusading expeditions opened their treasuries. A new wave of enthusiasm for the crusade swept across Western Europe. The Knights Templar, in particular, benefited enormously from the victory. Inspired by their sensational performance at Montgisard, donors showered the order with gifts. Renaud, Lord of Margat, gave half the income of several cities to the Templars. Nobles across Europe endowed new Templar commanderies. Recruits flocked to take the White Mantle and the Red Cross. For Odo of Saint-Amand, the victory was the crowning achievement of a long career. He was hailed as a modern Judas Maccabeus, the Jewish hero who had once liberated Jerusalem from pagan conquerors. His decision to break out of Gaza, to risk everything in a desperate ride to join his king, was celebrated as an example of faith and courage for future generations. But Baldwin knew that the victory, however sweet, had not changed the fundamental equation. The kingdom of Jerusalem remained outnumbered. Saladin remained in control of Egypt and Syria, and Baldwin's own body continued its inexorable decline. Within months of Montgisard, the king's condition worsened dramatically. His right hand curled into a useless claw. His eyesight began to fail. The lesions on his face spread, forcing him to wear a silver mask in public to hide the disfigurement. Yet he refused to abdicate. "The kingdom needs me," he told his council when they urged him to retire to a monastery. "Not because I am strong, you can all see that I am not, but because I am the only one who can hold the factions together. Guy of Lusignan waits like a vulture for my death. Raymond of Tripoli schemes in the north. Reynald dreams of wars that would destroy us all." He was right. The nobles of the Crusader kingdom spent as much energy fighting each other as fighting Saladin. Only Baldwin, with his combination of royal legitimacy and personal courage, could keep them focused on the greater threat. So, the leper king continued to rule, continued to appear at councils and courts, continued to lead armies when necessary, carried on a litter when he could no longer ride. He became a living symbol of sacrifice, a man who gave everything he had, including his own dying flesh, for the cause he served. The story did not end with Baldwin's death. His nephew, Baldwin V, survived him by only a year. The child king died in 1186, possibly of illness, possibly of something darker. The nobles who had been circling the throne for years finally made their moves. Guy of Lusignan became king through his marriage to Sibylla. Reynald of Chatillon continued his provocative raids, seizing caravans and threatening the holy cities of Islam. The factions that Baldwin had held in check now tore at each other openly. Saladin watched, waited, and gathered his forces. In 1187, exactly 10 years after Montgisard, the two armies met again at Hattin. This time, there would be no miracle. Guy of Lusignan led his army across waterless terrain, ignoring the lessons of previous campaigns. He rejected advice from veterans who had fought at Montgisard. He allowed himself to be drawn into exactly the trap that Saladin had prepared. Saladin cut off the Crusaders from their water supply and systematically destroyed them. The true cross was captured. The army was annihilated. Guy himself was taken prisoner. And Reynald of Chatillon finally faced the man he had tormented for so long. Saladin invited Reynald into his tent along with King Guy. He offered Guy a cup of cold water, a gesture of hospitality that, by Arab custom, meant the king's life would be spared. Guy drank, then passed the cup to Reynald. "You did not ask my permission before giving him water," Saladin said quietly. "I am therefore not obliged to grant him mercy." He drew his sword and struck Reynald himself, wounding him. His guards finished the execution. It was the vengeance Saladin had sworn after Montgisard, finally fulfilled. Within 3 months, Jerusalem fell to Muslim forces for the first time in 88 years. The Crusader kingdom was reduced to a few coastal cities. The great dream of a permanent Christian presence in the Holy Land had received a wound from which it would never recover. But Montgisard was not forgotten. The battle became a legend, told and retold across generations. It was proof that courage could overcome odds, that faith could move mountains, that a dying teenager and a handful of devoted warriors could humble the mightiest army of their age. The monastery Baldwin built on the battlefield, dedicated to St. Catherine, stood for centuries as a reminder of what had happened there. Pilgrims visited to pray where Christian knights had charged into impossible glory. Historians studied the battle as an example of tactical brilliance and spiritual dedication, and the story of the Leper King became one of the most enduring tales of medieval Europe. Baldwin IV was not a conqueror. He did not expand his kingdom or crush his enemies permanently. He won battles but lost the war. He delayed the inevitable but could not prevent it. Yet there is something in his story that transcends victory and defeat, something about a young man who knew he was dying, who felt his own body betraying him day by day, and who still chose to fight, who still rode to war when rational men would have hidden, who still gave everything he had for a cause he believed in. At Montgisard, on November 25, 1177, that young man led 450 knights against 26,000 enemies. He caught them by surprise, broke their center, routed their army, and sent the greatest Muslim general of the age fleeing for his life. For one shining moment, the impossible became real. In an age when empires rose and fell, when holy cities changed hands, when men killed and died for faith and gold and glory, there was one afternoon when courage alone proved sufficient, when a handful of men, outnumbered 50 to 1, charged into the teeth of an overwhelming host and emerged victorious. The men who fought at Montgisard are long dead. Their bones have crumbled to dust. The fortress of Gaza that Odo defended is now just ruins in the sand. The monastery Baldwin built has been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again across the centuries. But the story remains. Because some stories are too important to die. Some moments are too powerful to be forgotten. Some acts of courage echo across the ages, reminding us of what human beings are capable of when they believe in something greater than themselves. That is the story history tried to bury, but memory refused to forget.